Point of View Audio presents Part 7 and the conclusion of The Way It Has to Be, a novella written by Michael E. Hammond. The tears were rolling down my face as I stood in the aftermath of that long-ago fire. The memory of Blair's smile and kiss were still warm upon my lips. It was like waking from a dream, and I wanted nothing more than to go back to sleep. I gazed at the frozen landscape, hardly believing that it was the same place. It was bitter and cold, silent and still as ever, and as my story came to a close, I realized the gray void of monochrome clouds were beginning to break, revealing the pale blue of the afternoon sky.
"Tragic end to a beautiful friendship,"
Mrs. Madison said with pity.
"Now tell me, don't you feel better?"
"A little," I confessed. "And yet, so much pain comes from remembering those happier times."
"Yes,"
she said with a nod.
"But great things tend to come with great prices."
As we walked amidst the wreckage in the valley, Mrs. Madison prodded at the dirt with a stick, overturning debris and branches that had settled in the ground.
"You know what I find odd?"
she said, as she continued poking around. "What's that?" I asked.
"Even though the police found the boy who stabbed Blair," she said, "the Everetts went on to blame you for his death. They blamed you for all their pain. Ironic, isn't it? Blair Everett saved your life, and yet you are condemned for ending his."
"They didn't know the whole story," I said. "I can't really blame them."
"No,"
she said.
"I suppose not. But don't you just find it odd?"
I watched as the old woman bent down to pick something up. "What's that?" I asked.
"After all that," she said, "they would leave you their house. It just doesn't make sense, does it?"
"You have a point there," I agreed.
"And yet you still believed it in the end," she said. "I guess that just goes to show that you aren't as smart as you lead people to believe."
She turned to face me, the dark lenses of her glasses piercing right through me. In her bony, wrinkled hand I saw the unforgettable shape of the cultist's dagger.
"Look at what I found," she smiled. "A relic from your story, perhaps."
I looked on at the blade in the old woman's hand, remembering just how it had caught the light of the moon as it still burned with the flickering glow of the fire. I could remember how it hung over my head in the darkness, and how I thought that that moment would be my end. The cultist's dagger, the blade tempered by the black flame, the blade that had been jammed into Blair Everett's back, piercing his heart and taking him from me. "Don't mess around with that," I said. "It's not a toy."
"No, it isn't,"
she said as she admired the knife.
"It's a beautiful tool, really, just as you are."
Something in her voice sounded different. It was still raspy with age, but somehow it sounded less frail than before. She smiled a ghastly-looking smile, and the knife began to glow with the faintest hint of sickly purple.
"Unfortunately," she said, "sometimes if you want something done right, you have to do it yourself."
"What are you talking about?" I asked as I took a step back.
"Come on, Ben," she said. "Put two and two together. Don't you have any idea who I am?"
There was a sinking feeling in my stomach as the theory began to take shape in my head.
"Medora," she confirmed,
giving me a condescending nod.
"Medora Madison."
"Medora M.," I gasped. I felt like a complete fool. Not only had I been lured out here once by the cultists of the Black Flame, but after all these years I allowed myself to be lured here a second time by Medora M. herself. She twisted the blade in her hand, letting it catch the light.
"Oh, look,"
she said as she pointed at the sky with the knife.
"And it just so happens to be a full moon. How perfect."
"What do you hope to gain here?" I asked. "Your followers are gone."
"That may be so," she said, "but I don't need them anymore. The ritual has been performed already. Your body has been prepared and is ready to go. Don't you see? The Everetts didn't leave you their house. They didn't leave their house to anyone. I wrote that note. I called you pretending to be Belinda McCartney so I could get you out here."
She started to walk toward me, the knife glimmering with that dull, unnatural glow.
"Only one step remains. I cut you and let your blood flow so I can claim your body once and for all, this time with no interruptions.
Interruptions? I asked.
We are the same, you and I, she said. You may think that it was Blair that saved you that night, but it wasn't. It was him.
What do you mean? I asked.
The Black go to the woods, she said. He stopped the ritual that night by appearing to you, as first he appeared to me. Chaos ensued, and in the wake of his appearance, he let you escape. He even tried to save your friend Blair from the cultist who stabbed him. Why, I don't really know, and to be perfectly honest, I don't really care anymore.
I didn't care to stick around and find out what she was talking about. I turned and hightailed it up the hill as fast as I could go. To my surprise, Medora moved with just about as much speed as I did. I was amazed by how fast the old woman could run. I ran through the woods, stray branches smacking me across the face as I moved. Faster and faster I went until I allowed myself a glance behind. She was nowhere to be seen. Relief melted in a cool wave across my body, but I didn't stop moving. I ran and ran until I came to a large tree. I hid myself behind the tree, peering around its great trunk to get the first glance at the forest. The woods was silent. No sound of footsteps, not even the sound of breaking twigs in the distance. I wondered if she had fallen, maybe busted a hip as she tried catching up with me. I must have lost her, I sighed.
Lost who?
Her voice echoed from behind a nearby tree. She stood there, the knife in her hand, a wicked grin stretching across her wrinkled face.
Who are we running from, Ben?
I gasped in fear, taking off into the woods. I ran at full sprint before I could even process that it was Medora. My heart was pounding, my breath was heavy as I ran. Really ran for the first time in years. This time I could hear her footsteps crunching through the forest behind me. I didn't look back, for looking back would only slow me down. As I ran, the surroundings slowly became more and more familiar. It passed in a blur, but I ran through the unmistakable remains of our old campsite. Further and further I ran until the trees began to grow thinner, and the light of the sky becoming more and more evident ahead of me. The dense outer wall of the forest was fast approaching. I ducked, quickly passing between the trunks of the two trees, the doorway out of this forest of splintered trees and broken dreams. I ran through the grove, weaving along its crooked and winding path, hoping beyond hope that Medora would not find any shortcut through. These walls of brambles and wicked thorn bushes served as my allies for the first time since discovering this overgrown wilderness all those years ago. My heart was pounding, my breathing was heavy, and I wanted nothing more than to stop and rest, but I knew that stopping just wasn't an option. Out of the grove I ran, passing into the windswept landscape of the frozen grassy meadows. I didn't know where to go. I didn't know what to do. I was driven only by the purest instinct to run. In the distance, on the far-off horizon, I could make out the cube-like shape of the Everett house. It was the house I had once considered a home, the house where Blair and I had spent so many good times. I ran, and I ran, closing the space between myself and that once sacred place. The ground passed under my feet in a blur of grays, browns, and blacks. The cold wind bit and nipped at my ears. My face was frozen. My lungs burned like fire. My own fatigue was setting in, fighting against me as I was losing speed. I refused to let myself stop. I didn't need to outrun her. I just needed to not fall behind. I allowed myself a glance over my shoulder, only to find that Mrs. Madison was still on my tail. She was some distance back, but not enough to give me an ounce of comfort. I couldn't believe it. She was an old woman, wrinkled, hunched over, frail in stature, yet she moved with the speed that I couldn't seem to outrun. Thoughts passed through my mind as I ran, and I suddenly had two sources of motivation. The first was for my own life, the second for my ego. I could not let this woman who was more than 80 years old actually catch up to me. I ran and ran, continuing to hold my speed, when I suddenly remembered the nearing creek. It had always been a challenge to cross, even in its frozen state. I curved my path to meet with the particularly steep bank, leaping into the air when I finally made it. I landed hard on my feet on the opposite side, pausing only to catch my balance. I continued my pace, glancing back to see Mrs. Madison following suit. The jump hardly fazed her, and I knew in that moment that she had truly been touched by some dark and unnatural power, Her mobility and agility were proof of that.
"All I need is to stick you with this knife," she laughed in a taunting tone. "I can imagine now feeling my essence slip inside you as I make my home in your young and beautiful body."
I could see the wire fence growing closer and closer, but it wasn't approaching fast enough. I knew that if I could jump the fence just right, I could gain a little bit of time.
"Let the blood flow," she cackled behind me, "and my powers will be complete."
I was planning my jump, and I neared the fence. I need only wait for the right moment. Closer and closer it came until at last it was right upon me. I threw my hands forward, and in a split second it took to catch my breath, I grabbed the top horizontal post. With my own momentum, I leapt, leapfrogging over the fence. I landed hard, toppling over and rolling hard onto the ground. In a moment of panic, I tried to reorient myself, only to find that I was face to face with Mrs. Madison. She smiled a wicked smile, the knife hovering just over me. Instinct took over, and in one fell move I swung my leg around me, knocking the old woman to the ground. Before I knew it, I was on my feet again, running once more in the direction of the house. Closer and closer I ran toward the house until I was actually running up the driveway. With a thud, I stopped myself when I hit the car, fumbling with the latch. It was of no use. The door was locked, and I was running out of time. Panic overcame me, and without so much a thought, I staggered quickly into the Everett house. I slammed the door shut behind me and scrambled my way up the stairs as fast as I could. When I reached the second floor, I suddenly realized my mistake. I hadn't thought any of this through, and now I was doing nothing but cornering myself into a trap. I stood at the top of the stairs, not sure what to do. It would only be a matter of seconds before Medora would find me. Only a matter of seconds before Medora would make her kill. My eyes slowly adjusted to the darkness of the house, as the pale blue of the dusky twilight spilled in through the windows. The door to Blair's room was closed, and the tiny bathroom would provide no sanctuary either. I didn't know what to do. Every choice seemed to be utterly hopeless. No matter which way I turned, I would be trapped. Trapped, I whispered to myself. I crawled through the darkness, moving as quietly as I could, making my way to the door directly across the hall from Blair's room. At the foot of the bed, I knelt, trying to make myself disappear in the shadowy darkness. I held my breath as my heart pounded like a drum in my ears. I could hear the sound of footsteps moving downstairs. Mrs. Madison was inside the house. It was all only a matter of time. Louder and louder the footsteps became, until I realized that she was making her way up the stairs. Closer and closer she came, until she made her way into the hall. I heard footstep after agonizing footstep, until I could see her shadowy figure standing in the doorway.
"Can't hide from me," she said. "You gave me quite a fight there, Ben, but now you've gone and trapped yourself in."
She didn't move from the doorway. She stood there, toying with the glowing purplish knife.
"Do you have any idea how it feels to have your soul ripped from your body in the middle of the night?" she said. "To have all the freedom dangled right before you, and everything you've ever wished for at your fingertips. Do you know how it feels to get so close, only to be denied? To feel the freedom of shedding your mortal coil, only to be thrust back into the body of an old, miserable woman?" she cackled. "Of course you don't. That is the true epitome of being trapped. Let me tell you right now, what you feel now doesn't even come close to the feeling of being trapped."
Medora Madison stepped through the doorway. Step after tiny step, she traveled the room like a cloud blowing on the soft breeze. It was at that moment that I realized she couldn't see me. She could feel my presence in the room with her, but she didn't know exactly where I was. I watched as her shadow opened the closet door, and that is when I sprang to my feet.
"Ah," she shouted, "there you are."
I dashed out of the room, grabbing the door handle and swinging it closed behind me. I stopped at the edge of the stairs, a smile curling on my lips as I heard her fumbling at the door handle. "There was one part of the story I failed to mention to you," I said with a grin. "How the door to the guest room could only be opened from the outside." I always remembered Blair's premonition of fate when it came to the lock on that guest room door. "Mark my words, Benjamin," he said in a serious tone. Even you getting locked in that guest room holds an air of fate around it. Even though I'm certain he had meant it as a joke, after all these years, that moment of fate finally played out. I felt warmth in my heart that I hadn't felt in years, as I realized that in some way he was still with me, manifesting himself in the forms of the guiding hand of fate. As I stood in the hall and Mrs. Madison was pounding on the door, another memory flooded my mind. I remembered that day on Lookout Point with Blair. "Let's make a pact," he said, pulling the small knife from his pocket. "One day my house will be our house, and all of this will be ours. I, Blair Everett, bind in blood that if we both cannot have this house and land, then no one can have it." He slid the knife across his palm, and the fine line of blood trickled down from the steel. "It is the way it has to be." "It is the way it has to be," I repeated to myself in that dark and empty hallway. I ran out of the house toward the garage, hoping that what I needed was still there. I prodded around the dark, searching and searching. I knocked things off the shelf, scattering things to the floor. Then I found it. My heart fluttered in relief as I grabbed the large metal can marked gasoline. I made my way back into the house, up the stairs, and to the guest room door. I gave it a little knock. "Medora," I asked, "are you still in there?"
"Your body is mine," she growled, pounding on the door. "I can't be held here forever. Mark my words, I will find you."
"No," I said. "I can't hold you here forever, but I've thought of something better." I doused the door in gasoline, pouring it through the hallway, into Blair's room, the bathroom, and down the stairs. I made a trail through the house as I made my way from room to room, leaving just enough to get me outside in a safe distance away from the house. I stood in the driveway giving one last longing look at the Everett house before pulling a book of matches from my coat pocket. I looked up to the darkened window of the guest room, imagining Mrs. Medora Madison pounding on that locked door. I hesitated a moment, feeling only a shred of pity, before remembering that it was all because of her that I had lost my one true chance at happiness. I swallowed down the lump that was forming in my throat, and I plucked a match from the book. "I hope you were right, Miss Wayworth," I said as I struck the match to life. I tossed it to the ground. It sputtered at first until it found its purpose. There was a sudden whoosh and a flash of light as the gasoline ignited, and I watched as the path of flame snaked across the yard and into the house. Fire leapt from wall to wall, setting the place ablaze far faster than I ever expected that it would. Columns of black smoke bellowed against a backdrop of dusky blue sky. The flame had no pity, it had no mind, yet it consumed everything it touched. I could hear Mrs. Madison's horrifying screams from inside that inferno. I could see her shadowy silhouette moving in the burning guest room. My hands were shaking from the fear or elation, I couldn't tell which. I simply watched, unable to take my eyes off the spectacle before me. The fire burned with colors I'd never expected to see. Each flash and pop represented another of the Everett's possessions being consumed by that inferno. There was an explosion as the window to the guest room blew out, sending shards of glass through the air like shrapnel. Fire shot from the window, growing from a bright orange blue to a deep violet purple, then to black. The dark fire burned only for a fraction of a moment before the screams of pain faded into nothing. The black flame couldn't help her this time. There was a loud crash as the house lost its structural integrity. The great structure collapsed in on itself, reducing the once and proud beautiful house into little more than a pile of burning rubble. I gazed into the flames and knew that Mrs. Medora Madison's reign of terror had finally come to an end. As painful as it was for me to watch the flames consume this house that had once been so important to me, I couldn't bring myself to look away. I mourned the life I could have had here. I mourned all the memories that went up in flames. I expected to feel the emptiness and desecration and desolation all around me, but what I didn't expect to feel was the peace. I felt a smile tug at the corner of my mouth. It was not the hollow, empty smile I had grown so used to feeling, but a smile of joy. Warmth like that of the summer sun seemed to wrap around my heart. I felt like myself again for the first time in nearly 20 years, and I knew, more than anything else in this world, that Blair Everett was with me. It was not in the way that I had hoped or wanted, but he was there, silent as a butterfly unseen at my side. I knew now more than ever, as the house burned to ashes, that it was all the way it had to be. As I walked back to my car, prepared to leave, I turned once more to gaze at the fire. For some reason, I just didn't want to leave. I wanted to stay a little while longer. Was it to make sure that Medora Madison was truly dead? Was it to continue reminiscing about days long gone? Was it to bask in the glory and triumph of my victory over evil? Was it to linger in the presence of my once and future love? Or was it simply because I was the warmest I had been all day? This has been part 7, and the conclusion of The Way It Has to Be. Thank you again for sticking around, and I hope that you have enjoyed this audio presentation.